You land at JFK after 5 months abroad. Tired, jet-lagged, ready to get back to your normal life. You hand the officer your green card. He scans it. The machine beeps. But instead of the quick nod you expected, the officer pauses, looks at the screen, and says something that makes your stomach drop. Step aside for a moment. Another officer approaches with a tablet. A camera flashes. Your photo is taken. You assume it's routine security. But what most travelers don't realize is that this photo is part of a biometric tracking system now monitoring every entry and exit from the United States. And here's what's changed. Green card holders who thought everything was fine are suddenly being flagged the moment their card is scanned. A red indicator appears, a number shows next to their name. 183 days, 190 days, sometimes more. Within seconds, the officer asks the one question that can change everything. Why were you outside the United States for so long? What happens in the next 5 minutes determines whether you walk out of that airport and go home, or whether your green card is taken and your future in America becomes uncertain. Most people believe the danger is the biometric photo itself, but that's not the real trap. The real trap is what the computer already knows about your travel history before the officer even speaks to you. Because the moment that card was scanned, the system pulled up a complete timeline of your exits and entries. Every departure, every return, every single day spent outside the country. And if that number crosses a certain threshold, the officer's job instantly changes. What used to be a routine entry inspection can suddenly turn into a legal investigation about whether you abandoned your residence in the United States. Hi, I'm June, and welcome to Immigration Alert Center. Today I'm breaking down exactly what's happening at U.S. airports under the new biometric entry-exit rules that took effect December 26, 2025. And most importantly, how you can protect yourself before you ever reach that immigration desk. Let me start by explaining what actually changed and why it matters so much for green card holders. On December 26, 2025, the Department of Homeland Security expanded something called the Biometric Entry-Exit Program. The name sounds technical and harmless, but the change behind it is actually very significant. For years, the U.S. government collected fingerprints from many travelers entering the country. But now, the system has expanded far beyond fingerprints. Under the updated rule, facial recognition photography is now mandatory every time a non-U.S. citizen enters or exits the United States. That means when you arrive at an airport, the camera you face is capturing your biometric facial scan. When you leave the United States, the same thing happens again. And this doesn't just apply to tourists or visa holders. It applies to nearly everyone who is not a U.S. citizen, including lawful permanent residents. In other words, green card holders. It also applies to international students, temporary workers, and many other categories of travelers. Even groups that used to be exempt in older systems are now included. Children as young as 14. Elderly travelers who previously avoided biometric screening. Everyone is now part of this system. The goal of the program is simple from the government's perspective. Create a reliable biometric identity match every time someone enters or exits the country, so that authorities can track travel records more accurately and detect immigration violations more efficiently. On paper, that sounds like a straightforward security measure, but the reason it matters for green card holders has less to do with the photo itself and more to do with the data connected to it. Every time that camera captures your image, the system links the photo to a specific travel event, a departure, an arrival, a location, a date. Over time, these events create a detailed digital timeline of your movements in and out of the United States. The system doesn't rely on manual records anymore. It doesn't depend on stamps in a passport that might be missing or unclear. Instead, it builds an automated travel history that officers can access instantly when your green card is scanned. And this is where things start to get serious, because the data collected through this system isn't temporary. According to the policies governing the Biometric Entry-Exit Program, the information can remain stored for decades. In some cases, up to 75 years. That means each travel record becomes part of a long-term database maintained by the federal government. When you enter the United States, the system records the time, the airport, and the identity match linked to your biometric photo. When you leave the United States, the same thing happens again. Over time, the system forms a complete pattern showing exactly how long someone stays inside the country and exactly how long they remain outside of it. For tourists, this data helps identify visa overstays. For temporary workers, it helps verify compliance with visa conditions. But for green card holders, the implications are different. Because permanent residency carries a specific expectation under immigration law, you are supposed to maintain your primary residence in the United States. That expectation has always existed, but in the past, it was sometimes harder for officers to see the full picture immediately. Now the timeline appears automatically the moment your card is scanned. If someone left the United States and returned after several months, the officer doesn't have to estimate or guess anymore. The system simply displays the number of days outside the country. And if that number crosses certain thresholds that immigration authorities pay attention to, it can trigger additional scrutiny right there at the inspection booth. This is why many travelers who thought they were returning home normally are suddenly being asked more detailed questions about their trips. Now let me address the biggest misunderstanding that gets green card holders into trouble: the 6-month myth. Many people believe there is a strict rule that says if you stay outside the United States for more than 6 months, you automatically lose your green card. That is not actually how the law works. There is no automatic cancellation at the 6-month mark. However, once an absence crosses that time frame, it can raise questions about whether the resident truly intends to live in the United States. And those questions are exactly what immigration officers are trained to evaluate when someone returns to the country after a long trip. In the past, answering those questions often depended on what information officers could gather during a short conversation at the airport. Sometimes travelers misremembered dates. Sometimes travel histories were incomplete. Officers might ask several questions simply to understand how long someone had been away. But with the biometric entry-exit system now linking each entry and exit event automatically, that uncertainty has largely disappeared. When your green card is scanned, the system already displays your travel timeline. If you left the United States and returned 187 days later, the officer sees that number instantly. If the absence lasted even longer, the system shows that too. So instead of investigating how long you were gone, the officer's attention shifts to a different question. Why were you gone that long? And does it suggest that your life may now be centered somewhere outside the United States? Once that question appears on the officer's screen, the situation can move from routine inspection into something more serious very quickly. And this is exactly the scenario that is beginning to play out at airports across the country. A permanent resident returns after several months abroad. Maybe they were helping care for a parent. Maybe they were attending to family matters. Maybe they simply stayed longer than planned and didn't realize how the timeline would look when they returned. From their perspective, they're just coming back home. But from the perspective of the immigration system, the travel record now displayed on the screen raises a flag that needs to be evaluated. The officer scans the green card. The biometric photo is taken. The database pulls up the traveler's history and highlights the length of time spent outside the country. And then the officer asks a question that sounds simple but carries a lot of legal weight. Why were you outside the United States for more than 6 months? At that moment, many people assume the best strategy is to explain everything. They talk about the illness of a family member. They describe business responsibilities overseas. They apologize for staying longer than expected. They try to show honesty by sharing as many details as possible. But inside that airport booth, the conversation is not happening in a casual or sympathetic setting. It is happening inside a legal framework where every statement can be interpreted through immigration law. Officers are trained to document answers carefully, especially when a case may involve questions about residency. And once statements are recorded, they become part of the official record, describing why the traveler remained outside the United States for an extended period. That is why so many immigration attorneys warn permanent residents about something that seems counterintuitive at first. Sometimes, the biggest mistake people make at the airport is talking too much. Not because honesty is wrong, but because unstructured explanations can unintentionally create a narrative suggesting that a person's real life may now exist outside the United States. When that narrative appears in the officer's notes, alongside a long travel record displayed by the biometric system, it can lead to deeper scrutiny and sometimes referral to secondary inspection for further questioning. What surprises many green card holders is how ordinary explanations can suddenly sound very different when they are written down inside an immigration report. Imagine an officer asking why you stayed abroad for so long, and the first thing that comes to mind is the truth. Your mother was sick and you needed to take care of her. From a human perspective, that explanation makes perfect sense. Anyone would understand it. But immigration officers are trained to evaluate statements through a different lens. Their job is not to judge your intentions emotionally. Their job is to determine whether your residence is still centered in the United States. So when they hear an explanation like that, they may document it in a very specific way. Instead of writing a long personal story, the officer might summarize it as something like, "Traveler remained abroad to care for family member." In legal interpretation, that sentence can sometimes be viewed as evidence that the traveler's primary obligations are outside the United States. Now consider another very common response. Someone says they stayed longer because they were handling business or property matters overseas. Again, from the traveler's point of view, this is simply being honest about why the trip extended. But when an officer writes that explanation down, it might be recorded as maintaining economic ties abroad. That phrase carries a lot of meaning in immigration law because one of the key questions officers examine is whether a permanent resident's financial and professional life is primarily based in another country. Even something as simple as saying, "I didn't realize the trip had become so long," can sometimes work against a traveler. An officer might note that the individual appeared unaware of residency obligations tied to permanent resident status. When multiple statements like this appear together in an inspection record, they can unintentionally create a picture suggesting that the traveler's real life may be somewhere outside the United States. And remember, the biometric system has already provided the timeline of the absence. The officer doesn't need to establish how long the person was gone. That part is already verified by the database. The conversation at the airport is often focused on interpreting what that absence means. This is why immigration law includes something called the totality of circumstances test. It's an important concept because it protects permanent residents from losing their status based on a single factor alone. Just being outside the United States for more than 6 months does not automatically mean someone abandoned their residence. Officers and immigration judges are required to look at the bigger picture. They evaluate a range of circumstances that help determine where a person's real home is located. For example, do you maintain a job in the United States? Do you file U.S. tax returns as a resident? Do you have a house or apartment here? Are members of your immediate family living in the country? Do you maintain financial accounts and daily life connections inside the United States? And perhaps most importantly, did you intend to return to the United States as your primary residence even while you were temporarily abroad? All of these elements together form the broader context that immigration law considers when evaluating whether permanent residency has been abandoned. In many situations, travelers who spent extended time abroad still have strong evidence showing that their life remains anchored in the United States. They may have employment waiting for them, a lease or home they maintain, tax filings that show continued residency, and family members living with them in the country. Those factors can be extremely important protections under the law. But here's the challenge that often arises during airport questioning. The totality of circumstances test is meant to evaluate a full set of facts over time. often with legal guidance and documentation. The conversation at an airport inspection booth, on the other hand, happens quickly. Sometimes when a traveler is exhausted from a long flight and caught off guard by unexpected questions. If someone begins giving long explanations that focus heavily on activities abroad while barely mentioning the ties they maintain in the United States, the initial narrative created during that conversation may not reflect the full picture of their life. That is why immigration attorneys often emphasize a very specific strategy when answering questions during border inspections. Keep responses factual, direct, and focused on the core point that matters most under immigration law. Your residence remains in the United States. Because of how these airport conversations can shape an officer's first impression of your situation, immigration attorneys often recommend a mindset that is surprisingly simple but extremely powerful. Think of it as a disciplined communication strategy. The goal is not to argue with the officer, not to refuse cooperation, and certainly not to lie. The goal is to answer questions clearly while avoiding the instinct many people have to fill the silence with unnecessary explanations. Officers are trained to ask open-ended questions for a reason. When someone feels nervous or pressured, they often start talking more than the question actually requires. They volunteer extra details, jump between topics, and unintentionally introduce information that shifts the focus away from their ties to the United States. In immigration law, voluntary statements carry weight. If a traveler offers information that suggests their work, family responsibilities, or daily life are primarily based abroad, that information can become part of the record, even if the officer never directly asked for it. This is why many attorneys describe the safest approach as answering the question that was asked and then stopping. Short, factual responses keep the conversation grounded in the key point that matters most under residency rules: that your primary home remains in the United States and that your trip abroad was temporary. You are cooperating, you are being truthful, but you are also staying focused on the legal concept that defines permanent resident status. The moment someone begins offering long emotional narratives or complex explanations, the conversation can easily drift into areas that create confusion or unintended implications. Remaining calm and concise helps prevent that. It also signals that you understand the seriousness of the inspection process and are responding carefully rather than reacting out of panic. So what does that actually look like when you're standing at the inspection booth after a long flight? Let me walk through the process step by step so you understand how experienced immigration attorneys advise clients to handle these situations. The first step occurs before any questions even begin, when the biometric camera is used to capture your photo under the current entry-exit system. This step is mandatory. The camera matches your facial image with the identity linked to your travel record. Refusing the photo can immediately create additional complications because the biometric capture is now part of the required inspection process. The simplest approach here is to cooperate fully and remain calm. The photo itself is not the issue. It's simply the system verifying your identity and connecting the entry event to your travel history. After that, the officer will usually begin with very basic questions. They may ask for your name, your address in the United States, and the country you are returning from. These questions are routine and should be answered honestly and directly. If the officer asks where you live, provide your U.S. address. If they ask where you traveled from, name the country. Keep each response simple and factual. No additional stories are needed at this stage. Eventually, if the travel timeline displayed in the system shows a long absence, the officer may move to the question that often causes the most anxiety. They might say something like, "I see that you were outside the United States for 6 months and 15 days. Why were you away for so long?" This is the moment where many travelers feel the urge to explain everything in detail. But experienced attorneys often recommend keeping the answer structured around 2 essential points: acknowledging the reason for the visit, and clearly stating that your residence remains in the United States. A response might be as straightforward as saying you were visiting family and that you always intended to return to your home in the United States. That answer addresses the question without expanding into unnecessary territory. It communicates the temporary nature of the trip and reinforces the central fact that matters under immigration law, that your primary residence remains in the country you are returning to. Sometimes the conversation ends there, and the officer simply returns your documents. But if the system has highlighted a longer absence, the officer may continue asking questions to better understand your situation. This is where travelers often begin to feel pressure, especially if the officer starts typing notes into the computer or writing information down while you speak. Seeing that can make people nervous, and when people get nervous, they often begin talking more quickly and offering additional explanations that weren't actually requested. The key thing to remember is that questioning by itself does not mean you are in trouble. Officers routinely ask follow-up questions when reviewing travel history, and the way you respond can make a significant difference in how the conversation unfolds. If the officer asks why your trip extended longer than expected, the safest approach is still the same. Keep your answer short, factual, and centered on the idea that your residence is in the United States. For example, you might explain that family circumstances required your presence for a period of time, and then calmly reinforce that your home, work, or daily life remain based in the United States. That keeps the explanation connected to the key issue the officer is evaluating. If the officer asks what ties you maintain in the country, that is your opportunity to briefly mention the elements that demonstrate residency. Things like your job, your home or apartment, your tax filings, or immediate family living with you in the United States. The important detail here is that these answers should be concise and truthful. You're not trying to build a long legal argument at the airport. You're simply responding to the questions while clearly reinforcing that your life is centered in the United States and that the trip abroad was temporary. There is another moment during airport inspections that many travelers don't anticipate, and recognizing it can help you stay calm if it happens. If the officer begins documenting your answers in detail or indicates that your case may require additional review, they may tell you that you need to proceed to secondary inspection. Hearing those words can feel intimidating, but secondary inspection does not automatically mean something negative is about to happen. It simply means another officer will take more time to review the situation in a separate area of the airport. At that point, the questioning may become more detailed, and officers may ask for additional clarification about your travel history or your ties to the United States. This is the stage where immigration attorneys often recommend remembering a very important right that travelers have during the inspection process. You are expected to cooperate with lawful inspection procedures, but you are also allowed to request guidance before answering complex questions that could affect your immigration status. A calm and respectful way to express that is by saying that you would like to speak with a supervisor or seek legal guidance before providing further detailed answers. This type of statement does not mean you are refusing cooperation. Instead, it signals that you understand the seriousness of the situation and would like to make sure you respond appropriately. In many cases, simply requesting clarification or supervisory review can slow the process down and ensure that the situation is handled carefully. It also helps prevent a traveler from feeling pressured into giving rushed explanations that might later be misunderstood. The most important thing during any inspection is maintaining composure. And in a world where immigration systems are becoming more automated and data-driven every year, preparation is one of the most valuable tools any traveler can have. If you know other green card holders who travel frequently or have family overseas, sharing this information with them could help prevent serious problems at the airport, because many people only learn about these issues after they run into trouble, and by then, the situation is much harder to fix. Stay informed, plan your travel carefully, understand your rights. These are the best ways to protect your status and your future in the United States. I'm June from Immigration Alert Center, and I'll see you in the next video.